Good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea Whittington, and I am the Senior Manager of External Affairs for the Chicago Urban League. And it is my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you tonight to our convening on racial equity. And I am just here to share with you how we actually got here today. Some may think that because of the climate in the nation, that we may have planned this maybe a week or two ago, but these conversations and the start of these convenings actually began with conversations back in December between our president and CEO, Sherry Runner, and the Pastor Witt of the Chicago Temple. Sherry is a faithful member of the Chicago Temple. And they had conversations about the importance of having conversations with individuals who don't necessarily agree. For example, how many of you like to watch baseball? How many of you like to watch basketball? How many of you like to watch soccer? So as you can see, we have our differences, our likes, our dislikes, etc. And so tonight we will focus in on that and also our difference in generations, which will yield such an inspiring conversation. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring to you one of the most phenomenal moderators. He has such a long history to have been on this earth such a short time. We first encountered Dometi Pongo when he had his tenure at Talk Radio's WVON. He has since progressed and has started a new journey at WGN Radio, and we couldn't be more proud of him. But yet he still continues his partnership with the Chicago Urban League. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator for tonight, Dometi Pongo.
That was one hell of an introduction. Round of applause for Chelsea, please. And the debt is mine, or debt to the Chicago Urban League. The partnerships that I've had with them have been very fruitful, not only in the discussions, but some of the partnerships I've made with people in the audience that we've had a chance to speak with. So it's really humbling that all of you have joined us this evening. And, without further ado, we'll get right into it. As she said, we didn't start this because of what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. Sherry Runner is a visionary like that, and all of us know what the climate is with the current president, current political climate. It was no surprise to many people of color what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? And so that just makes this conversation all the more relevant and all the more important. I'll go ahead and swing it to the panelists to introduce themselves and just to let you guys know how they're positioning themselves on the panel. We'll start on the far left, the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, Sherry Runner. Again, thank you for allowing me to kind of host this panel and this conversation and just let them know a little bit about yourself and more about why you decided to have this convening.
So I don't even know that I should be on this panel. I'm way down here on this end because while I am a baby boomer, I like to think that I'm at the tail end of the baby boom. And so they just allowed me to sneak up here so that I could be a part of this conversation. But one of the most important things about what we want to do as the Urban League is continue the conversation. It seemed to have stopped. It seemed to have stalled. We think that there is important work to be done by all people in terms of how we view ourselves as a culture and society. So as we started to think about, last year was our 100th anniversary, and as we start to think about what happened in that 100 years and where we were and the work that we were doing, it became really clear and apparent to us that we must do something to move the needle. We don't want to have these same conversations 10 years from now or 20 or 50 years from now. And one of the things I'd like to do is put the Urban League out of business. I don't want this to be a constant conversation that we have to have. And so that means that we have to connect with people that are way younger than us, way different from us in all kinds of ways. So that means race, religion, ethnicity, thought patterns, everything. This conversation has to include all, and we really must start having conversations that are going to change things, not just for the sake of conversation. And so that's why I'm here, and I'm hoping that's why all these wonderful, beautiful young people are here.
Round of applause for Sherry Runner, please. I'd also next like to introduce Kofi Ademola. He's an activist, community organizer, Pan-Africanist. He's an organizer with Black Lives Matter Chicago. One quick distinction I want to make, too, as we talk about intergenerational activism. We kind of use Black Lives Matter as this sweeping, term for all activists under the age of 40 or so. But that's not the case. So he's actually an organizer with Black Lives Matter, the organization. So if you can, just give us a few comments about yourself and why you're here today.
Cool, thank you. Sherry just set a precedent, so it's kind of hard to follow up behind that. I'm going to be real brief. Another organization I'm a part of is called Regima Medics. And the reason why I want to uplift and bring up medics is because the work that we do in community. And I was just having a conversation about the University of Chicago and getting the trauma center. So long story short, it was a protracted 5-year struggle to get a trauma center on the south side of Chicago after some young people lost their friend to gun violence who could have been saved had there been a trauma center to take him to, right? So two of our founders, Amika and Martine, saw the need to have community training around first responder care. So Martine was a nurse, so she did research and everybody kind of came together. We put it together a collective that teaches people how to treat gunshot wounds, how to treat stab wounds, and now we've moved to teaching people how to deal with asthma attack, diabetes, and some other things that impact health in the Black community because it's about social justice around health. So I just wanted to uplift that in this space because I think people have a broad general view of Black Lives Matter, and we're going to talk about that tonight, so I didn't want to be redundant. But I think it's important to know that there are so many different grassroots organizations that are coming out of community that see a need and step up to meet that need, and that's part of self-determination, and that's about Black people having agency and having the ability to do things for ourselves without the resources and structural sort of institutional support sometimes. That isn't the way that it should be, but because of the things that Sherry talked about just historically, we see that kind of happening again and again in the spirit of the Black Panther Party, for example. So I just wanted to bring that into the space. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to this nuanced contextual conversation because I think it's one we constantly have to have. It's an uncomfortable conversation. It's a conversation that we all won't be in agreement about, but I think we can be principled and respectful and dig into some deep things. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Round of applause for Kofi, please. And I just want to say this too, much in the spirit of Black Panther Party, there isn't just marching, just organizing. Organizing, as you can tell from what he said, goes a lot deeper than that. Proud to call Kofi a friend. When I go to events that he's had, we've got 16-year-olds teaching us how to do CPR. They're doing health demonstrations. He's doing organizing within some of the roughest communities in Chicago and trying to get different organizations who don't see eye to eye to see eye to eye in ways that may save all of their lives. And he's really humble about that work, and he's got his head down into it. So when I look at him, I don't see what a lot of people think that marching is what activism is. Activism is investment on the ground in these communities, and he represents that. So thank you for joining us, Kofi. Next on the panel is Judy Levy. She is with I don't know where your bio went. Here it is. She's the executive director of the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. They help to galvanize the company's voice and impact as a partner and ally to marginalized communities in Chicago. That word ally is so important, so I can't wait to delve in. But could you please tell us more about your bio, who you are, and what positions you're on the panel?
Sure. I'm Judy Levy. I'm very happy to be here with my esteemed panel mates. And I'm, for those of you who don't know, the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs is a 53-year-old Jewish grassroots social justice organization with the mission of combating poverty, racism, and anti-Semitism, working in partnership with diverse communities. And this is a very important, critical, and challenging time. I know that we all feel it, and we all feel how important it is to have allies and people on the ground and people who are committed to grassroots organizing and activism together. And I think that in the space, it's really hard to have honest discussions because we don't always talk so openly and honestly about some of these issues. So I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'll admit I feel like an inept ambassador for the baby boomer generation, but I'll do my best on that. And I'm eager to talk to you more about the progressive Jewish community of Chicago and our work together.
Please, a round of applause for Judy Levy. And thank you so much for joining us. Michelle Mbekyiani Wiley is the Community Justice Staff Attorney at Sargent Shriver Law Center on Poverty. She graduated from the University of Chicago Law School. She has one of those bios that make you think, what have I been doing for the past 27 years? You know what I'm saying? She, in law school, she served as law clerk for the Police Accountability Clinic and the Invisible Institute, which, as you all know, with the Invisible Institute, they published the autopsy of Laquan McDonald and really helped to push that narrative forward and publish that story, give it the attention it needed. She also started her legal career in the civil rights team of Equip for Equality. Michelle, please give us a few words.
So, can you hear me? Yeah, awesome. So I work at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and there I focus on criminal justice reform issues, specifically policing within Chicago public schools, mental health, gun violence, and an array of other issues, and voting rights within the jail population. What really informs the majority of my work is working inside Cook County Jail, specifically in the maximum security divisions, and just speaking to young people of what goes on in their community and what policy solutions can we work on together. So in this space, I'm hoping to contribute some of their narratives and just speak not just on the work that I've done, but how speaking with young people has informed a lot of policy change within this state.
Round of applause for Michelle, please. And last but certainly not least, Emmanuel Johnson II is a program officer at the McCormick Foundation. He's also a Chicago Urban League Impact Fellow. We were just speaking before this program about intergenerational partnership, and the Urban League's Impact Fellow program is a perfect example of that, through which he comes out of. He's also served on the Foundation's Racial Equity Committee, the McCormick Foundation that is, aiding to pave the way forward to more equitable grant making. So he's helping us get dollars for these nonprofits that we got. That's what he does. Let us know more about what you do, Manny.
Thank you, Sherry, and all the staff at Urban League for providing this opportunity.
You look close.
I'm loud anyway. So I grew up right here in the city of Chicago on the southeast side. Shout out to my mother right here for showing up. And went to high school in Inglewood. So needless to say, I saw a lot of the disparities that go on in the city, and I wanted to do something about it. But because there's a long history of service in my family, I joined the Navy right after high school. I mean, being completely honest, a lot of people serve for great reasons, and I did that as well. But also, I grew up in the south side of Chicago, and sometimes you got to figure out a way to get out of here. So I served in the Navy for 6.5 years, deployed 3 times, served in the National Security Agency. And what that really did was spark something that was in me, a passion for service. So I came back to Chicago on an appointment with the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs, doing policy advising and community outreach. And got an opportunity to come over with the McCormick Foundation and be a program officer over there. Our CEO was in the crowd, David Hiller. So if we need any money,
money point where you at? All right. Oh, there he is. All right. Oh, he looked like money. All right, we'll be good.
The McCormick Foundation really gave me an opportunity to continue to help veterans, but under David's leadership, he really wanted to get involved and talk about the issues that are affecting the city around violence. So he admonished all our programs to be able to go in and start getting involved. And when we got an opportunity to look at it inside the veterans program, we realized a lot of that work was going on. So what we really want to do is try to kind of change the narrative around veterans, but also make sure we're looking at them as strategic assets. So there's a lot of organizations that are empowering veterans to go into communities that they're already in, that they grew up in, to resolve those issues. So that's one of the ways that through the work, and I'm learning a lot through the work in the Urban League and my time with the Metro Board, and prepared to learn a lot with the Impact Program. Really just understanding what's the best way to advocate for people inside of communities of color, but also give them the resources they need to be successful.
Absolutely. Round of applause for Manny Johnson, please. And as I make sure my phone is on silent, I've got to remind you guys to use our hashtag. Our hashtag is CUL Race and Equity. That's CUL Race and Equity. I love when you guys live tweet, because this is how I go back and test the effectiveness of the panel, right? What are some of those recurring themes? Make sure you live tweet comments that meant something to us, something you didn't agree with. We're going to have that after the panel where you guys get a chance to chime in. But let's take this conversation to social media, because that's what we're talking about, intergenerational connectivity. Let's jump right into it. First question is, I guess, what is your perception right now of social justice movements in this country, and are they intergenerational? Meaning, do you see a partnership between older generation, older activists, and young activists, and have they ever been?
Well, I'll start, and I think there is some connection with community organizing models. I mean, as much as we think that this social justice movement is new, doing one-on-one meetings to organize people is not new. And I think that a lot of organizers that I've spoken with that I have respect for speak highly about who their mentors are. And I think that is something that still preserved. Now we still have the 1-on-1,000 when you're hashtagging things and tweeting and so forth. And I think that just, amplifies the message. But I still think that basic community organizing models are still being used throughout various different organizations that are actually doing really great work.
Sure.
I think the way that information is communicated has changed. And so the difference between maybe baby boomers and millennials, if we want to just take that broad swath, is the fact that we don't have the same communication of our history the way that we used to have it. The issue there is the fact that our history has been whitewashed in so many ways. It has not been communicated in terms of the resilience and the ability of African Americans to survive in the United States. And because of that, oftentimes there becomes a split between what is perceived as the work that was done during the civil rights movement and the outcomes that were achieved and what has happened since that time. So it's important to me to start to think of ways that we can communicate. They always had the idea that we pass stories on about our lives and our histories. And I'm not sure that in a hashtag or in 140 characters, we can do that much more. In the way that our families have been torn apart, those stories and that history may not be passing on to younger generations. And so while the fight is the same and the impetus is the same, and that we often have to try and do some things over and over again, it is about this resilience that we don't give up and that we keep supporting each other. And so I don't think there's a lot of difference. It's just how we do it.
I mean, if I would touch on a little bit of, I guess, kind of the temperament of millennials, and it's the, both of these work? Okay, thank you. It's the idea of, younger people are always ready for action. They talk about millennials and instant gratification, but to paint a picture of that instant gratification, like if somebody was generous enough to give me $5,000 right now, by the time we finish this panel, I can have already applied for my 501c3, found a location to hold offices, have a virtual assistant, have a bank account set up, right? So if I get frustrated with what the work of one of these organizations are doing, and I say I want to do it on my own, I can have almost a legitimate looking organization within 2 hours. So just really putting it into perspective of saying that we want things to happen now, but also because of the way technology has grown and information, we have the ability to do things now, right? So would it be a great organization within 2 hours? Probably not. I would be running it, so maybe 3. But we really had to look at, like, when you're dealing with our generation and saying that, like, we're difficult to work with, we also have the agency and the capacity to be able to get things done on our own, right? And is that the best way to do it? No, but we also have to look at how we're incorporating millennials into the mission of the baby boomers, right? It's all our work, but we also have to find a way to get them involved in a way that benefits them. And also we have to listen to the older generation. So we really got to look at what the tools are and what the temperament is of this, of our generation, and how we can enable them and get them activated into the mission.
I heard two things too. So as we talk about this generational split, you have this technology and this impatience that millennials have. It's like, why don't you just quick pay me? Like, you know what I mean? Or whatever the case may be. You talk about that, right? But then you also have this whitewashing of our history that you talked about. And I want to go to that one really quickly because I was talking about this before the panel. I don't know if you guys seen that. Have you ever seen these memes that it says, we're not our grandparents? It basically saying that our grandparents were soft when it came to the civil rights movement, not remembering that Huey P. Newton was also a forefather, Marcus Garvey, Huey P. Newton. I said that already. Who's the other guy? Nat Turner, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about Nat Turner. We're going to go all the way back. But because, and Martin Luther King, right? We get this idea because he was nonviolent. Come on, drop the name, drop him. And you made a good point about this earlier, because we have this idea because of the whitewashing of our history. Even though we live in this generation age, we have this perception that in the 60s, black folks were just rolling over and accepting what the status quo was, even though that method led to some of the freedoms that we enjoy today, even though we have a lot more to do. Can we kind of delve a little deeper into this perception that the civil rights movement was somehow softer or more, more turn the other cheek-ish than this movement that we have right now, and that being a perception that creates a disconnect between the two?
I interpret that differently, to be honest. When I think of not my grandparents' movement, I think of more so what it has become. I think we've made a social justice a corporate venture through nonprofit industrial complex, and I think that impatience of, can we do things now? I mean, how many grant applications did SNCC have to do? I mean, think about it. Like, right. Can you imagine having to go through that whole process to plan that? Now, maybe they did, but I think it's become a real business as opposed to organizing individuals with the resources, pooling resources like you used to. And I think that is something that I admire about the civil rights movement. Whereas now, I mean, you need to, and not to knock foundations, because we are funded by foundations, for the record, including the McCormick Foundation. You may want to delete that from the tape before I get fired. But there is this frustration sometimes in my work that sometimes I just want to do it. Right. I've thought it out. I've got the people on board. We've gotten their approval, but we don't have funding for that. That's not what the foundation wants us to do. I was like, well, but this is what needs to be done. And I think that is where I find the very same people that were in the trenches back in the 50s and 60s and 70s are now in positions of power where they are at the whim of the foundations and the big funders. And I think I do find that somewhat problematic in my personal opinion.
Kofi, your organization doesn't operate in that way when it comes to grants. I'm sure there are probably donors, and Black Lives Matter, of course, receives donations from people who want to support your mission. But you organize a little differently. How would you, comment on that same piece, that generational disconnect, where if the funders aren't on board with whatever the initiative is, then it just doesn't happen? And how can, as a grassroots organizer, that be flipped on its head?
Well, I also kind of wanted to bring us into historical context. I heard SNCC being brought up, Stokely Carmichael. We have to remember that Ella Baker organized SNCC, right? It was her being inspired by some young people boycotting, I think, or doing a sit-in at Woolworths, like in 1947 or something, or like early 50s, way before the so-called civil rights movement really got momentum. And she saw potential in that. She saw that she needed to organize young people so that they can be out there and advocate for themselves, and she understood the role that they would play in the movement. I think we get remiss in that, right? Especially when we think about Chicago. Fred Hampton was 20 years old, when he was organizing. He started out as a youth, 13 in the NAACP, and then, eventually got into, organizing with the Black Panther Party, right? I was on a panel with Dorothy Tillman, and she was telling me about how when King, when he was organizing out of London, okay, I thought the mic went out. My bad. When he was organizing out of Lawndale, he sat down with a lot of the guys. So, he sat down with Jeff Ford. He sat down with David Barksdale. And, and again, I think, we forget that, Jeff Ford, David Barksdale, Larry Hoover, these young people were in their late teens, early 20s, and they organized thousands of people, maybe not for what we wanted them to, but they were organizing, right? So I think we get, this sort of sanitized or romanticized kind of viewing of history, and then don't connect that back to what's happening right now. I know for us, for example, like we definitely have elders and mentors that we look up to. We work with the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. They came out of, with Angela Davis doing prison abolition work in the 70s. You know what I mean? They've been organizing for community control of the police since the early 70s. So how could we not follow in that footstep if we're talking about, being prison and police abolitionists, and what does that look like? like. You know, we also are in tune with our African People's Revolutionary Party, who Kwame Ture founded, right? And we study our history, we study what our elders and our ancestors did, and we connect to that. Nationally, you know, the different chapters around the country and just the movement for Black Lives, people are looking at history and learning from that and figuring out what went right and what went wrong. So I think it's unfair to like categorize it as that, because I don't think there's an intergenerational gap. I think it may be like political and ideological differences. What I would say what's at the forefront now that's different than the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement is intersectionality. I think that's one thing that we kind of see at the forefront now. But even that was inspired by like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and so many other, you know, powerful Black feminists, right? This idea of, you know, we are at the intersection of different identities that get oppressed. You know, so for example, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, you know, I'm a cisgender male, meaning that I identify with the, you know, the label, the gender label I was given at birth, right? I'm heterosexual, I'm a Black male. So even though I have oppression being a Black male, I also have privileges because of that, because of my gender, because of my sexuality. That means I have certain power and privileges, and I can move in spaces that, let's say, a member who's transgender may not be able to, or an organizer that I'm working with disabled may not be able to, right? So this, you know, movement being led by Black women, by queer Black women, you know, centering our most marginalized people, that's new, you know, in this sense, as far as like a national level. So they're not only uplifting Black men that are being killed by the police, but they're saying, how are we being oppressed through different identities, and what does that intersectionality for liberation look like? So that also means that we're not only just showing up for Black people, but when the Muslim ban happened, we're showing up at the airports helping to shut that down too. You know,
but there were organizations too that felt that the Black Lives Matter shouldn't be showing up for Muslim organizations, because there was conversation on social media. Have Muslim organizations ever showed up for Black people?
The 5%ers.
Break it down. Come on. That's what this conversation is for.
Let's go back to the 5%ers in Harlem. I mean, the Nation of Islam. Are we really saying this?
Right.
Have we really forgotten? I mean, that was recent. I mean, that.
But those are Black Muslims.
Those are Black Muslims. They're thinking about
Black
Middle Eastern background Muslims.
Okay,
go ahead, Judy.
I had a few things to weigh in on here, because this notion of intersectionality is very, very prominent now in the Jewish community, which sometimes considers itself marginalized and sometimes considers itself white and assimilated, and sometimes is both. And then when we see something like what happened in Charlottesville, it's pretty clear that the Jewish community is not at all safe from the hate and the white supremacy and the racism that's happening across our country now, that many of the haters have been unleashed in their hatred. And if we don't show up for Black people, for brown people, for Muslim people, then it's not going to work. The whole goal of liberation is for all of us to bond together and figure out what does it mean to stand up for each other. And if I had to just go back to that question about the generations, you know, I do think, at least I'll just say, in my community, you know, because Dr. King was really such a inspirational prophet, I feel like we got a little bit stuck there, and we continued to, you know, look towards him and quote him when there were so many really young, you know, fantastic and talented leaders and critical issues of our own day that I think we didn't fully, you know, grab onto. And I feel like we all feel like now is the moment.
Mm-hmm. Judy, if you could, what in the Jewish community, do you see the same, I guess, different interpretation of history that affects the way different generations move? Like the same way we talked about in the Black community, right? And you touched on it with the perception of Dr. King and how we hold him on this pedestal and act like he's the only one that ever said anything worth quoting. Does that happen in the Jewish community, and in what way does that, I guess, inform the way you engage with folks in different generations in your organization?
You know, I think it does happen in the Jewish community, and sometimes I feel like we, you know, we get all twisted and become our, you know, I don't know how many of you followed that there was this big blow up with the Chicago Dyke March, and there was a woman who brought a rainbow flag that had a Jewish star on it, and there was a whole lot of backlash, and she allegedly was kicked out of this march. And, you know, so many of us are fighting on the same side until suddenly it gets explosive. And, you know, we talked a little bit about this. I mean, I'm hesitant to call it, you know, political correctness, because it's kind of, you know, I've heard our president use that word and it's gross. So, you know, I'll just say, like, you know, we're supposed to be in this together, and then when we start, you know, eating our young, it's you know, it's just divisive or more divisive. And so, in my organization anyway, we're working really hard to bring both of those generations to the table. And sometimes we have to like tell the young people, no, we have enough young people. We got to bring in some more of those older folks, because the young people are impatient, the older folks are pragmatic, and, you know, a little tired, but, you know, that's okay, because there's a lot to learn from each other. And, you know, we're just trying to work it so that we build enough relationships so that people learn to respect each other and learn from each other.
You pulled the mic.
Yeah. I mean, well,
look at me. You pulled the mic. No.
Well, first I have to defend philanthropy, right? I mean, I think I can't speak for philanthropy wide, but one of the things our foundation does is really finds a way to get community involvement and community voice, right? To empower the individuals that my constituency that I serve to do the things that they need to do, right? So it's not my money, right? It's your money. You just have to figure out how to get it from me, right? Under these parameters. But we also make sure that we're not going to organizations chasing dollars, right? To say that, hey, like, well, we're looking for this program. Like, oh, we can do that, or we're willing to do that, but no, like, was that your original intent? Because I don't want to just give you money to do things that you're not equipped to do, and that makes me look bad, and it makes your organization look bad. So we work a lot to say, hey, look, here are the parameters of what we're looking for within this grant, and are you able to fulfill those? And if you're not, like, I mean, it doesn't mean the relationship is over. It doesn't mean that we're never going to talk to you again, that this opportunity is not the time for us to get money, but also or give you money, but also we're partners, right? So you don't have to call me every time like the grant cycle is up, you need money. Like, we're partners at the table, because I see things from a larger scope than anybody else. I mean, a lot of other people do, because I talk to multiple organizations. So at the foundation, we look to be partners. And to everybody else's point, I think that we did a really great job of edifying Dr. King and Malcolm X, but the issue becomes Dr. King died almost 60 years ago. So for me, as a 29-year-old person, I see that, but that I mean, the age difference between where he was when he died and where I am now is vast, but also the generation he lived in, right? And we didn't, and I don't want to say we, but society didn't do a really good job of edifying the next generation of people, right? There should be somebody 45 years old right now that's getting blasted in schools that say, hey, this person in your lifetime has done these things. That way you have a connection to what's going on, and not to say there's a disconnect. Oh, this person contributed greatly in the civil rights movement, but as Sherry said, oh, nothing happened after that, right? Like, Dr. King did his job and we all went to bed and got good jobs and lived on, and all of a sudden all this racial tension happened again. Like, what happened? But no, it's been incrementally going on since the end of slavery, but especially since the end of the civil rights movement. So we have to do a better job. Especially, I mean, not only during Black History Month, but in March, let's talk about some of the individuals you named, like Audre Lorde, and talk about the intersectionality and how pivotal her words were to the cultivation of Black thought. And I don't think we do a really good job of, we can talk about the big people in February, but in March, we need to talk about the everyday heroes that we may have an opportunity to encounter and how we can follow in their footsteps.
I would actually go further and say not just individuals, but the organization. So when I moved back to Chicago, I first clung on to the National Urban League, because you read about the National Urban League in history books, and my parents read me Chinua Achebe because they're Black nationalists, basically. So I knew almost every organization for the most part that was in the area, and I clung to the Chicago Urban League after law school. And a lot of times we focus on the higher policy, which is very important. You know, big picture, what policy reform do we need to ensure that people can live a life of dignity? But we never really talk about the direct services of what organizations were doing for what did someone need right now. And so if you go through like an orientation of Chicago Urban League, well, for Metro Board, shout out to Metro Board, which is affiliate of which is a part of the Chicago Urban League. I remember watching the video of like when people migrated here, how are people getting jobs? How are people being trained for jobs? These are basic needs that people need. The average person's maybe not thinking about the high up policy reform and thinking, how can I feed my child today? How can I ensure that I have a roof over my head? And I think we need to continue to uplift those organizations that are doing the really in the trenches, on the ground work so people can just get to the next day. Because it is that bad for individuals. And a person that has done a lot of work in the county jail, a lot of the young men that I'm speaking with are not thinking about which community organization I want to join. They're thinking about, okay, how am I going to get food for tomorrow? Or how am I going to get out of jail, first of all? You know, that's a basic need. Or how am I just going to survive today? And we need to ensure that we're bringing that into the forefront of our curriculums, that there are organizations that have been doing this work. You may not see them get a Nobel Prize or see them on the forefront with the president, but they're doing the groundwork to ensure that the average person gets what they need.
Absolutely. So this is a real issue. So there are parallel tracks on what has to happen. We need to understand that there's not only this need for the immediate the symptoms that have been caused by decades of racism. We need to figure out what are those policies and practices that have been put into place to create an overwhelming number of young black men in jail. And so because of that, we have to do both. We have to advocate. We have to change policy. We have to understand why. This morning on your station, they asked me why racism is worse now than it was 8 years ago when Obama took office. And I had to tell them that it's not. And so these are very critical issues. And so once we start to think about how we change this narrative about who Domity is in this room, but who he might be on the street with a Chicago police officer, those are very different conversations, and we have to do both. And that's why this is why it's so frustrating to me. There is no difference. One of the things that we are to talk about tonight is Black Lives Matter, the next legacy of the civil rights movement. Well, it is something that comes from the history or the outcome of the civil rights movement. And so it is very important that we understand how all of this threads together and how we cannot divide ourselves in order to make sure that what happens for my next. I spoke this weekend at a thing, and my daughter just turned 21. I have a 21 and a 25-year-old daughter. Both of them are single. I don't know. I don't know what their prospects are moving forward, but I do know the more young black men that are put in jail who don't have an opportunity to live lives, the likelihood of them finding mates in our community diminishes every single day. And so for me, it's very personal from that perspective, but from everybody else's, because I don't know what talent is getting destroyed by the jails and the policies. And so I just need to make sure that that's not the case.
You were able to see that connection, right? You were able to connect what's going on with black men and mass incarceration to your daughters. And I feel like with questions that come out like, why is racism so bad now, but it wasn't 2 months ago, right? This idea is that they weren't able to connect themselves to the movement until a mishire passes away, right, at the hands of a white nationalist with what happened in Charlottesville. I guess my next question is, and it kind of ties to actually what we had planned to talk about, how has the fight for civil rights changed in the past year? And do you think there'll be more allyship among other organizations because you have hate groups that hate so many people that it's now more obvious that there's a need for different people to band together in a real way? Do you think that there's going to be, has it changed in the past year, or are we seeing social justice movements not much since pre-Obama, since the pre-Obama era?
Well, I'll qualify this. We have to remember the movement for Black Lives. See, it's just not me. I'm not tweaking.
Nah, it's not you. You just keep talking.
The movement for Black Lives. Nah, that got real loud. Okay.
The movement. There we go.
All right. Movement for Black Lives came out of the Obama era, right? You know, I always think about when Obama, I always mess the brother's name up. Louis Gates Jr., is that his name? The brother that's the professor, had the...
Louis Henry Gates.
Yeah. Louis Henry Gates. So for y'all who don't remember, Louis Henry Gates was just going into his crib, minding his business. A police officer arrested him for breaking into his own house, right? This was before Trayvon Martin happened. And what Obama does is he takes him and this officer on public television, sits down with them to have a beer to talk about this, you know, problem as if it was just a mistake, right, an aberration, you know, something that could be just worked out. And the officer was just like, oh, yeah, I shouldn't have did that. And, you know, all was forgiven. They shook hands over that beer, right? So that kind of let us know, you know, the climate that we were going into. So then when Trayvon Martin happened, you know, and then we get to Mike Brown and the rebellion and uprising in Ferguson, you know, we can kind of see, you know, where we were going as far as a movement. But from personal experience, I don't know if you all are familiar with Joshua Bill, but he was a young brother that was visiting in town last year, November, to bury his cousin, and he was shot and killed by police in Mount Greenwood. Mm-hmm. Me personally, I had never heard about Mount Greenwood or like what that community was about until I went there. So myself and a couple of organizers, we go out there to comfort and console that family. We weren't out there to protest or anything. We were just checking in on them and their safety and well-being, because we know that was a very traumatic experience. They just buried somebody, and now here they are losing another family member to violence, right? We get out there, and I felt like I was in 1950s Alabama. I have never experienced that in-your-face kind of like just horrendous, disgusting racism. You know, people were driving by calling us the N-word, go home, driving by screaming Trump 2017, right? Because this is before Trump was elected. And people were just, you know, just terrible towards us. They came out there with baseball bats. They came out there with Blue Lives Matter flags, and they like literally, you know, it was about 100 people across the street from us. And as they were coming up with knives and bats, the police would like take it from them and like pat them on the head because they knew them personally and told them, no, don't do that. And this is what we experienced. So we had to call up a bunch of other black people to come out there so we can get that family up out of there safely. Because the problem was their cars were cut off because it was a crime scene. So they couldn't leave. And the majority of that family was from Indiana. So they were literally stuck there. So we had to keep them safe and protect them. And that right there was kind of like that first visceral, you know, experience of bigotry and prejudice. But I think we got to get definitions right, because I think a lot of people think racism and they think about a racial slur or somebody, you know, having a prejudice or bias towards them. They don't make the distinction between structural and institutional racism versus interpersonal bigotry. And I think that's where the discrepancy comes, and I think that's where we have to constantly educate people and give them more clarity about it. Because me personally, I can care less about somebody's personal, you know, bigotry towards me. You can feel however you want to, as long as you don't have the power to affect how I live, my quality of life, and where I can live and what that looks like. But the moment you have the power to decide I can no longer work here, or that I'm going to jail, or that my life doesn't matter, where you can take it and not have any consequences, that's the structural violence, the institutional racism that we are fighting against and what we're trying to dismantle. So I just wanted to qualify that, because I think it's important that we kind of always have that shared language, because too many times people think about racism and they think, well, I didn't call you the N-word, or I didn't say this towards you, so I'm not racist, you know, or I don't have privilege, and all these other kind of conversations. But we get away from the structural thing that we've been experiencing since our ancestors were first brought on this land.
Absolutely. Man, you had something.
Yeah, and I think, and I really do apologize if I take us down the path that we don't want to go down, but I think with Donald Trump, right, running for president, right, before we even get to the point of him being elected, the things that he was saying was totally disgusting, right? But him getting elected emboldened it, right? So anybody who felt those things or thought those things or wrote them or put them on social media knew that it was acceptable for them to say it in public. And so I'm not going to say that like, talk about how it's changed, because I think this is something that happened in previous generations, but I feel like in my lifetime, I just never saw the blatant racism, right? You hear about it underlying, or you hear about structural racism, but the fact of the matter, when I run through my neighborhood and I'm still in the city, and I can't run a half a block without seeing Blue Lives Matter flags, right? And that's just a symbol, right? That lets the people know that, hey, we've drawn a line in the sand, right? We say that Black Lives Matter, and I say that Blue Lives Matter. And hey, Black life in this neighborhood, we value police lives better. So if you want to run through this neighborhood, just know that potentially something can happen to you if I feel uncomfortable, right? And that's a clear message that somebody wanted to send, right? So whoever sold the flags, right, because they were in mass, I don't think everybody in the neighborhood got together and said, hey, let's go buy a Blue Lives Matter flag, right? That was a fundraising effort, right? Somebody from possibly the police union came door to door and say, do you support police lives? Give me $20 and we'll ship you a flag. And they fly the flag right next to the American flag, right? If you think you belong in this country, I care about my country, but also I care about the police that protect me from you, right? So I think that that's just one way that a community has been emboldened, but also another community is being terrorized, right? Verbally and non-verbally. And I think that and maybe I wasn't aware, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but a year ago, I don't think that it would be that blatant, or, just the vitriol that people are saying these things with, and once again, like on social media, and then get surprised where there, I don't know the name of the group, but there's folks on there that say, oh, they identify who you are on social media and begin to talk about like your personal life, right? And begin to tell your job, hey, like this is the type of person that you're employing. Also, this is what they're doing on work hours, right? To kind of balance that. But that's the response that you have to those individuals, because they feel emboldened to make these criticisms about groups of people. And I think that's the real change that I've seen, or the real going back to how it was, is just the blatantness of it.
I'll just say, like, the racism that gets me is how sophisticated it is, the structural racism. So well before Trump, I combed through SEC filings for CCA and GEO, which are the largest private prison industries that get about 40% of their business at minimum from the Bureau of Prisons. And if you read SEC filings for prisons, it is one of the most inhumane thing I've personally ever read. What they tell investors of whether this is a profitable industry to invest in. So in one of the filings I found for CCA, which is Corporation Correctionals Associate of America, or something like that, CCA is what they're called. In one of the filings, they stated, this will be a good year because they've increased Border Patrol agents, and there's been an uptick in the population from 18 to 25. So this isn't a filing. Like you can Google this, SEC filing. So this is what they're telling people: you should invest in us because we're going to get more bodies. And guess what color those bodies are going to be? Black and brown. This is well before Trump. This is well before Obama. This is well before Bush. And just how the black and brown bodies have become a commodity, not just still are a commodity, not just in this country, but around the world, is something that can never be overlooked. But who takes the time to comb through SEC filings? It's easy to get mad at 140 characters, but look where the money is going. I mean, you should see the documentary Slavery Under Another Name. Convict leasing. We've been doing convict leasing was fresh after slavery. They're like, we got something for you. We've got something for you. And it keeps on renewing and renewing and renewing itself. And it becomes more and more discreet and more in the weeds that after a while you can't even see it. If you look where prisons are, just even in the state of Illinois, when Edgar was governor, when we were trying to get the Supermax prison, towns were competing to have a prison brought to their communities. Guess who was going to fill those prison beds? If you look at collective bargaining agreements with unions who, I'm not saying bad about unions, but just collective bargaining agreements with unions usually are based on how many beds are filled. So regardless if you have people in those beds, you're paying for X amount of beds. These are supposed to be profitable industries. So they're going to make sure that those beds are filled. And guess what they're going to be filled with? Black and brown bodies. That is how sophisticated. And then to add insult to injury, You put them to work. Where do you think your Victoria's Secret bra is made? You know?
Yeah.
We have to really be honest with ourselves but who takes the time to comb through the records to find out where is this labor coming from? Is anyone ever paying attention to Angola and what's going on down there? Mm-hmm. It's straight up slavery down there. But again, these are already marginalized people that are further marginalized being put in the shadows. And I honestly don't know what it takes to that's why I'm very big on abolishing prisons. People think it's, not realistic, but it's gotten to a point where it's not even about the crime anymore. It's about the profit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So having grown up in the city of Chicago, my life was always about the segregation. So it necessarily wasn't Mount Greenwood, but was always Cicero and Bridgeport. These were always neighborhoods where I knew that I should not go or be caught by myself. I might be able to drive through them, but I should not ever get caught there alone. And so this is nothing new. This kind of segregated, racialized hatred and stereotyping of people who are better than others or who are different from others because of whatever their race or ethnicity is, or religion. And so that's a real problem. And it's interesting to me. This weekend, I happened to listen to, and so Reverend McCoy, just close your ears for 1 second. I listened to Reverend Moss talk about Reverend Wright. And he talked about Reverend Wright, and the thing that came out of that was Wright was never wrong. And we remember this because President Obama had to disavow his church as a result of a sermon that Reverend Wright gave. And so I put this on Facebook to talk about the fact that we've got some real structural issues to talk about. And I have a very good friend who went to high school with me, who actually has my same birthday, but he's a little younger, and he's a white guy. And we have started to have a conversation back and forth. And he inboxed me and he said, you're never going to start a conversation with white people because they loathe Reverend Wright. And I said, well, I can't even start there because he was a scholar, or he is a scholar and a man of God, and he hates no one. And so if you're telling me that we can't even start to have conversations because you loathe someone so much that you don't even know, but that you've been given a image of as a result of the media, then we have got a really long way to go. And one of the things that Pastor Witt and I wanted to do was to open these conversations to people who are of not like minds. Mm-hmm. I can talk to you guys probably all day about the way I feel and the things that I know, and we'll have some differences, but until we get to the point where we can have these conversations civilly among people who don't agree with us, we are really never going to change. And those people in Mount Greenwood and what used to be Bridgeport are going to stay racist for the rest of their lives. And those people that cheered for Trump last night, they're going to stay the same way because all they're doing is listening to each other.
And I think the internet reinforces that. We can choose what information gets filtered to us. In fact, the algorithm, based on what we like, is going to show us more of what we already believe. I want to go back to the point that Michelle made as we get to the solutions-oriented portion of this. So what is the answer to supporting people like you in the work that you do? Because many of us saw 13th. A hand up if you saw the 13th documentary, if that was your entry point into kind of what mass incarceration kind of is. And we saw, remember that scene with the big list of corporations, J.C. Penney, Victoria's Secret, that were benefiting from the incarceration of black bodies. Does that mean, what does it mean? How do we move forward, right? I mean, even if you talked about Angola, even if the cell phones that we use, iPhones, the chips that we get them from on the backs of black bodies, yet I still have an iPhone, right? So does this mean we boycott Apple? Do we boycott Victoria's Secret? How do we support your work, and how do we move towards a solution when the problem seems so big?
I would say not support my work, but support the people that are directly impacted. I mean, I know the game pretty well of, Michelle, you present well, we'll put you in front, but I'm from Oak Park. I don't even live in Chicago. You know, I've never spent a day in prison out of that wasn't my choice. It's just to do work. And it's like, I'm always trying to get the young men I speak with, like, you guys have the answers because you're directly impacted and you have skin in the game. And those are the people that need to be organize themselves. Those are the people that need to be given the resources because they are deeply invested. People that have been formerly incarcerated, they are organizing. They are organizing. And those are the people, just because they may not be what people want to see on a resume because they have a felony conviction in the past, they are the most dedicated individuals that I've ever worked with when it comes to any of this type of work. And those are the people that I look to mentor me, tell me what to do, how can I support? And my biggest thing is to be someone that does research. Like, how can I support you through research or getting you to the appropriate people that can fund you? And I think that's what we need to use our privilege, because we all have some level of privilege, to elevate the people that are marginalized within the marginalized populations.
Go ahead, Judy.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I also wanted to take a moment to ask the question, how many people here are in some way, somehow involved in the issue of working for police accountability in Chicago? Because I really think that across the board, that is, one of the most important issues that we all have to come together on right now. And I want to just harken back to what Kofi said about the difference between racism and bigotry, because I know that sometimes the police push back and talk about how policies have to change their hearts and minds. And I was reminded that actually they don't have to change their hearts and minds. They have to obey the law. And without a current legal enforcement mechanism, and with a bad contract and all kinds of things that allow them to get away with what they get away with, there continues to be structural racism, every day, every hour in our police department. And, I think we all agree they have to be held accountable, and that's an issue that there are a lot of different groups coalescing around, and that would be a place where I think we ought to be taking action.
While we have you too, Judy, I wanted you to, because you piggybacked off what Kofi said, and he was talking about the importance of definitions, right? Defining what that really is. How would you define allyship and intersectionality as it works with your organization, or works with those communities?
Allyship is one that I think, we've struggled with a bit, because sometimes in some contexts it sounds like being an ally is being a good buddy, and that is. Should I switch? This one's bad.
Oh, you said that wasn't even that one, so okay, go ahead.
And okay, so I think that allyship is a real recognition of our shared humanity. We're a faith-driven organization. We're not exactly faith-based because we're not like religious, even though we do have 12 congregations that are involved with our work. But I think that allyship means that we stand together, we stand in solidarity. We're all made in the image of God. We all have a stake in everyone's liberation, and and that's how we have to act every day. And so, even if people are all people in the Jewish community, though the Jewish community is actually more diverse than people think, but even if we're considered, often to be people of privilege, we're also, people who have a collective history of oppression and understand oppression well. And, we get it. And so, therefore we have an obligation and a real calling to be allies with marginalized people, in the city.
I want to, before we go ahead to questions in the audience, I want to go step by step with each of the panelists and talk about those solutions. You already talked about it, Michelle, investing in the people that are most affected by policies, by mass incarcerations, whoever they may be, right? Meet them where they are. Manny, is there something that is solution-oriented from your vantage point that you think each and every one of us can kind of help either you with or help disadvantaged communities with?
Yeah, I think what I learned was one of the easiest thing I did was join the Urban League, right? And not saying that was easy work or the work we did was easy, but I realize it's harder to try to control your circle of influence, right? So it's easy for me to get in the room with people who are like-minded and talk about all the oppression that's going on. When I have friends who I served with who are still good friends of mine, who are Republicans or have different viewpoints, I have to start having conversations with them and explain to them, like, from a personal standpoint, how what you're advocating for affects me, right? And if we can't have the conversations with people in the room, like I know people who are my age who grew up in a rural part of the state who deal with their parents on a holiday basis, right? Because they have a totally different belief system, whether it's because of religion, whether it's because of where they grew up, or whether it's because of their political beliefs. But those are the lives and the hearts you have to influence, right? Because those are the ones you can influence. I can come here and start talking to people about whatever is powerful to me, but if you have no investment in me, it's not really likely that you're going to listen. So you have to have those tough conversations with friends, family members, co-workers, and you have to advocate where you are, right? You don't have to, I mean, one of the issues with edifying our civil rights leaders is we think that the only way we can make impact happen is if I get 1 million people to march on Washington. But if I go into the McCormick Foundation every day and we talk about racial equity, right, and we have these tough conversations, right, because when you're talking about these issues in a room full of people who don't look like you and don't understand what you're going through, they may say some things, or if they don't say anything, right, you feel uncomfortable because they may say something, right, and how am I going to react, right, and how is it going to affect the things that I have to go through at my workplace, right? But they're difficult conversations, they have to happen. So don't think that you have to go out and change the world by activating 1 million people. Activate the 5 friends that you have that may say some really misogynistic things about women, right? And you can just laugh it off, or you can say, that's not cool, right? And hold people accountable. So you have to hold your circle of influence accountable. So I would admonish people to do that.
That's great advice. If I can piggyback off that as we go to before we go to Judy, one of the most frustrating things was having white friends so passionately decry what happened in Charlottesville, but we also had debates about them not really believing mass incarceration was a thing, or not really agreeing with affirmative action, or not really understanding why it was that when we were in the car together, I was kind of nervous if the police pulled up next to me, right? And so it's easy to point out blatant racism. I mean, it's obvious. If someone used the N-word, you know what that is. But that person over there, that poor person saying the N-word, that redneck, doesn't affect me as much as this guy in policy-making power that doesn't use the N-word because it's not cool to say in public, right? So I think that right now, as we have white allies that are really passionate about what's going on, it's a perfect time to have these conversations about more destructive racism that's far less blatant. I want to swing it over to Judy, too.
I'm going to pass on that one because I talked about that.
Oh, you talked about it, too, already. Oh, go ahead.
I think one of the biggest differences between like this, the civil rights movement around race and like the gay rights movement is that like chances are like all of a sudden you won't have like a black son, right, out of nowhere, like, oh, I found out like 17 years into his life like my son is black, like I don't know, right? But I think that when you have people who advocated against gay rights and all of a sudden like your daughter is a lesbian, well, not all of a sudden, I'm sorry, but you find out that she's a lesbian, now all of a sudden your viewpoint changed. Like, I mean, not that I was a misogynist by any stretch, but I didn't really begin to understand the things that women went through in society until I had a daughter, right? So I started talking to women. I'm like, well, I don't want my daughter to go through that. And what do you mean 73 cents on the dollar? Like, my daughter's better than any man out here. And I think that, I think to that point, like, it's difficult because you can go, a lot of white people can go their whole lives without interacting with black people, right? You talk to the doorman on the way to your building, and all your friends are people who are like-minded and look like you. And I think that we have to find ways, once again, to have those conversations with people that don't look like us, because that's the key. Because if it's not touching your life with people that you know, I don't think it's going to change.
I have to say something, because that's literally my life. So my son's father is white, and his grandparents are white, and they were Trump supporters. And what in that conversation, I learned a lot. So for instance, I've learned not to take any history for granted. So when I explain that, this person's supported by David Duke, KKK, and they grew up in Cicero, actually. So that's back when Cicero was Cicero. And one of the relatives said, "What's the KKK?" And I was just, where do I begin? So that was a moment where I decided to be unapologetically black and say, well, they would chop off people's balls and lynch them and burn them. I mean, I just wanted to be as gruesome as possible so they understood how serious this is. But to be in that space now with a biracial son, I find that people are a bit more receptive because he's so darn cute. If you ever see him, you're like, how could anyone hate this adorable boy? They're obsessed with him. But yet in the same conversations, we have to check. Sometimes I have to check some uncles and say, hey, you can't call someone a little Nazi. That's inappropriate. I mean, things that happen at my Thanksgiving dinner, you would think it's a movie. But at the same time, they absolutely love our son. So those tough conversations, it's so confusing because you're so nice, but then you have these moments where it's like, how could you support someone and say these things? Do you not know that we're Black? And it's very confusing space to be in when it's family.
Yeah. When
it's a stranger or a friend, it's like, I don't really know you like that. But when it's family where we're stuck with each other, having those conversations is extremely, to the point where sometimes, and I'm a very vocal and not shy person, I walk out the room when Fox News is on because I know some nasty conversations are going to happen. I pretend I need to go to the bathroom because I can't be a martyr all day. I just can't. It's not good for my mental health. But I think those conversations, you take care of yourself, but realize they're going to be really, really uncomfortable.
Anyone else want to chime in before we go ahead to questions as we talk about solutions? Solutions. Give us some solutions, and then Sherry, if you want to chime in, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, I just want to uplift a lot what Michelle was saying around, especially around abolition. You all can check this out. It's called $1 Million Blocks. Literally $1.4 billion in Chicago has went towards mass incarceration, and you can see it broken down from block by block in communities. So like Austin had the highest number at like $241 million. West Inglewood was like at $142 million. And Roseland was up there. Bronzeville was in there. So you see all this money get invested into mass incarceration, right? Instead of our community. So when I talk about solutions, at least on a short-term basis, we talk about transformative justice. And in that framework, we talk about restorative justice. So divesting from prison and policing and reinvesting that back into our communities, right? Chicago spends about $4 million a day on police. That's over 40% of Chicago's total budget. So as we see teachers getting fired, as we see daycare centers closing, as we see mental health services depleting and schools getting closed, we see police getting hired and more police in our communities, right? Right now, I want to say in October, City Hall is going to vote on a $95 million police academy in West Garfield, right? That money should be going into mental health care, into trauma centers, into education, economic revitalization, development, those kind of things, right? Why is all this money going into mass incarceration? So solutions aren't that difficult. We just have to organize and come together and educate our communities and demand that these resources come back to us. It's a very simple solution. Martin Luther King, again, over 50 years ago, fought for housing rights and for community and economic development in Lawndale. And in Lawndale, it looks worse than it did, 50, 60 years ago. That's by design. We can get into redlining. We can get into all the structural things that Chicago in particular has to deal with. But that's what it boils down to for us on a short-term basis. On a long-term basis, Fred Hampton said it best. Fred Hampton said, you can't fight capitalism with capitalism. You fight capitalism with socialism. So if we aren't getting to like the bigger structural things, that exploit and oppress and, destroy our environment and all these other kind of things, then we're going to continue to have these conversations 10, 20, 30 years ago until we're talking about why we're fighting over water. We have to learn our lessons from Katrina. We have to learn our lessons from Flint, especially in our communities. We are very vulnerable. So we aren't talking about getting these resources to build up our communities and really build safety and security in a new way that isn't steeped in punishment and destroying lives and tearing apart families, but really about centering people, healing people, and holding people accountable. Then this conversation won't end, unfortunately. So solution is going towards restorative justice, transformative justice, community revitalization, and divesting from institutions that have historically attacked and marginalized and disenfranchised our communities.
Somebody please get that into 140 characters and put that on Twitter for me. Again, our hashtag is CUL Race and Equity. Sherry, did you want to chime in or you want to go straight to questions?
No, We can go straight to questions. I just want to say ditto everything that Kofi said. It's really true, and I think each one of us needs to understand that we are personal advocates. And so every day when we're out and we see things and hear things and do things, it's incumbent upon us to hold everyone around us accountable for what's happening in our society. And it cannot be, you cannot get disgusted, you cannot get discouraged. This is a life fight at this point, and we really must make sure that all of us are saying, knowing, educating ourselves, understanding the ramifications, and not just sitting by to think that things are going to change or going to be okay because I'm okay.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Now we just want to open up the floor to questions. Anybody want to chime in? Go ahead, brother. Oh, yeah. Let me see. I'll run over to you. Yeah, I'll do it. Hold on. We're recording some of this, so I want to get your voice on it.
Again, first off, thank you guys so much for having this event. I learned so much tonight. This is part observation, part question. There was a lot of comments about historical figures in this climate over the last 50 years, and a lot of names were thrown around that I do appreciate, and I think is very important for us to be knowledgeable on and be educated. But being 28, growing up on the south side of Chicago and Roseland, there were other figures that meant more to me than some that were stated today. And I'm actually surprised some names weren't stated, like Kendra Lamar, who partnered with Barack Obama for his mentor program in Compton, or Chance the Rapper that's done so much for the city and recently partnered with a company to give away 30,000 backpacks. So for me, I really didn't understand the concept of racial inequality till I hit the corporate environment around my 20s. So growing up as an adolescent, I was more concerned about making it home safe versus, being racially profiled. So my question is, for some of these figures, for me in the hip hop industry that has almost the biggest following in any genre of music, which is having a big influence just as much as race and religion, do you guys see any benefit in partnering with some of these individuals in these groups that are kind of unorthodox or non-political because of the following that they have to make a greater impact in certain environments and neighborhoods that we're speaking about today?
It's always been political to me. And that's why I brought up the 5%ers. And I did one of my thesis was jihad jams and hip hop, and how I'm obsessed with Islam and hip hop and the intersectionality of both. Someone I wanted to actually bring up was Tupac Shakur. A lot of people laugh at me when I say that, but I think he was a prophet of that time, and someone who, growing up in a bubble of a suburb, provided me a window of the injustices that were going on around the world, not just in the United States. And I think he had one of the most, and people will hear me talk about this all the time, one of the most profound lyricists when it comes to speaking about people's realities. Another person who I listen to, especially when it comes to mass incarceration, Lupe Fiasco. Prisoner 1 and 2, I encourage everyone to listen to that song. Audubon Ballroom, All Black, everything. I could go on all day about it. I go to every single concert, and he's another individual. It's like reading a book. It really is. And I would not have been as enlightened on these issues, but not for music. Personally, I seriously grew up in a predominantly white bubble where you did not hear about these things. But listening to music was like, hold up, is this true? Public Enemy, another prime example. A lot of times people overlook because it's not orthodox, but this is not something of the 2000s, 90s, 80s, 70s. I think music has always been, from the soapbox, people would stand up on top of crates and recite lyrics about what was going on in their neighborhoods in Harlem. This is our tradition. To even going back to the continent of Africa, oral reciting things orally has always been a tradition of the African diaspora, and it's something that we should uplift. And just because it doesn't go with traditional forms of writing, which tends to be what the colonizer preferred, doesn't mean it shouldn't be uplifted and remembered.
Absolutely.
Also to that point, I think we do a lot to edify, like the Chance the Rappers and Lupe Fiasco, but also we got to talk about the rappers that were like the NWA or Cash Money Records, right? And we could talk about how disgusting their music is in some people's opinions. But we think about art is just a function of what you know, right? So I'm not going to write stories about living in a mansion in Manhattan because I don't know that life. So what these rappers are doing is telling their stories, right? They go outside. They're not glorifying killing people. They're just saying, this is what I see, right? I seen the person when I walk outside get shot, right? It's not like, oh, this is a great thing. I'm from Chirac. They're just trying to tell you that I'm comparing a city, the third largest city in the richest nation, to a place that's war torn right now, right? And I think that gets lost in translation. So when we talk about art, like, we don't get mad at somebody who painted a picture that was like oppressive or like, oh, this was disgusting. Like, no, like, they're telling the stories that they know. And like, I mean, I think a lot of people articulate the history very well, but other people are telling their stories as they see them. I think it's important for us to understand that individuals dislike hearing that because my theory is that the reason I get frustrated when people talk about the violence in Chicago is because I think it's kind of a distraction. Because to me, that says that if poor people weren't killing each other, we would be okay with it, right? Like, it's okay with you being poor over where you are, but now that you're killing people, like, it's making my city look bad. So now it's a problem. But they've been talking about this for years in the music in Chicago, in the southern part of the United States. And I think it's important that we edify those people for telling their stories and how important it is to hear those stories about what's going on in these neighborhoods.
Okay. All right, thank you. So real quick, Jamila Woods, she came out and showed us love for a remembrance for Rekia Boyd. She's come out and supported, no media, no nothing. She came out, sung for free. My homie Malcolm London, who was with BYP 100, is a phenomenal artist, poet, and activist. He connected us with Vic Mensa. We went out to Standing Rock to bring supplies out there and help the indigenous struggle to prevent the pipeline, right? Chance has supported us like on some low-key stuff that I can't even talk about, but that support has been there, right? So there is this growing kind of connection between artistry and activism, especially here in Chicago, that we're seeing. But it definitely needs to be cultivated a lot more. It has to be developed. There needs to be a direct line. Right now, I got a friend that's doing a documentary on the rise of drill music, but also the rise of activism. And he's showing like a linear progression of both of those kind of growing out of Chicago for the very same reasons. So I can't wait till that comes out, because that's going to really like talk about the violence in a very nuanced way. Coming from two, which you would think would be polar opposites, but they're actually very interconnected. So I appreciate that question.
That's a great question. Even thinking about the underground arts community at the Artist Lounge, there was a this poetry mic that I used to host with, the last Artist Lounge is going to be on the 8th. I didn't tell you that, got to invite you. But anyway, it was the open mic that I used to host, but he brought Rekia Boyd's brother, the family of Sandra Bland, so many who passed away, Sister Arewa, who was her nephew, Pierre Lowry. They came out and we gave out money to the person who, it was a poetry slam, who had the best talent, and we donated that money to that person, but the whole night was uplifting his family on Rekia Boyd's birthday. And just, there are a lot of things happening grassroots, but you're right, we need to do more to tell the public what's happening and make that cool. There's so many rappers like Jeezy donates money to the hood all the time in Atlanta. But it's cool to brag about throwing money in the strip club and not throwing money at impoverished neighborhoods for whatever reason, right? So that's something we need to do in hip hop with that. Even Lupe Fiasco works with Google Startup, and he goes to Lawndale and Inglewood and looks at black communities where they have tech prodigies in these communities and gets funders there and say, well, who has the best idea? We'll invest in it. And that's something that he's been doing for the past few years, I believe. So, we just got to uplift and continue to tell those stories. And that the onus is on me, too, as a media person. And I think that's something we definitely need to do. I hope you still remember your question. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nilsa. If anyone was wondering my name. I feel blessed coming here. And in the beginning of my day, I was like, should I go? I've been working 8 hours. I have this graduation that I have to do, working for nonprofit. Not me, I'm hosting a graduation, but thank you. But we're talking about investment. Something that you mentioned was like, I have the money, I have your money, just tell me how to get it. But I think about it the other way around, right? How do we invest in these millennials? How do we build leadership within, not someone who already has thousands of dollars to benefit or to give to our community, but how do we invest in the members in the community? How do I talk to my brother about power analysis and racism and any other things. We talk about let's do one-on-ones and let's have these difficult conversations, but it's hard to have difficult conversations when my family are not educated, right? When they don't know the difference between a problem and an issue. We're talking about organizing. How do we organize and make it beatable, right? Because I don't want to get 1,000 people and they don't know a power analysis. They don't know, to get a stop sign in, who do we need to get that stop sign in our block? Is it the alderman? Is it the congressman? And most people, or at least in my family, I'm not going to say most people, but the people around my social family or individuals, I'm the first one, college level graduate, not only master's level graduate. And for them, it's like, oh yeah, okay, no, I hear you, but I don't hear you. And how do I make them hear me? But how do we not only make them hear me, but let me invest in you. We're talking about let's invest in our organizations, but how do we invest in millennials, or how do we invest in individuals who are not known what to do, or say, you know what, this affects me, but I don't know what to do. I'll support you to get you quiet, but I don't want your support. I want you to be my ally.
So essentially, how do we invest in millennials? And then how do you invest in people who might not be as sophisticated in their understanding of the issues?
I mean,
leadership training.
I think it's not a function of finance, right? I mean, everything boils down to money, but like it's time, right? Like you have to convince individuals that have some level of relation to the people you're looking to help to come back and help them, right? I don't know exactly how you motivate people. I can tell you the reasons why I came back, but we have to make sure. I think I saw a meme that says like the idea isn't like to get wealthy and move out of the hood. The idea is to get wealthy and make the hood a better place. So we have to find a mechanism, and I mean, I have to find a mechanism to be able to begin to recruit people who have similar mindsets and similar experiences into the neighborhood that I come from or I work in to be able to support. And I was blessed that when I returned home to Illinois and Chicago as a veteran, that there is a ton of black veterans who were doing community work that said, if you want to do some work, this is where you show up, right? And it gave me the opportunity to go work with One Summer Chicago and mentor youth, right? And I try to provide that same opportunity. So I look at like self-accountability first. So we have to look at how can we get the people around us, once again, that are like-minded to come back and work on the things that we're doing. Because if I can't convince my friends to do it, how can I convince anybody else in this room to do it? So I think we have to advocate for ourselves to the people that we know.
I just want to add that, I think for those people who work in nonprofits, it's really important that we have youth engagement programs. And we do at the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. We have a teen program. We're doing a college organizing fellows program because we know that the young people are the ones that absolutely need to be invested in. And I would also say that we have to mentor young people ourselves because, we're deeply committed to this and we, are seasoned. And I think that when we tell people that they have special skills and talents and, some spark that we really want to nurture, that also lights a fire in them.
And I think really quickly do what Kofi did. He brought some people with him. Sometimes it just helps to bring the people with you to these types of forums so that they can get the knowledge and get the information. I think we have time for about two more.
And while you're doing that, I just have to point out that, I got to call out the black men in the room. We have to show up more. I can't tell you how much. How many things I go to and they're like, well, where the rest of you are? Where the rest of you at? I don't know. I'm trying to find them too. But I mean, and there's reasons why. We talk about mass incarceration. There's a lot of us missing, but the ones that aren't, we have to make sure that when there's mentoring programs that we show up in numbers because we were vulnerable and we made it out, and that's the most vulnerable population, black male. So we have to make sure we're showing up and showing out.
All right, hello, my name is Danielle, and I have basically been over the last month been thinking about how after Charlottesville, yes, there's a clear that's wrong, that's right for our majority counterparts, but I personally, going to a public university and also going to a private Christian school with majority white people, I feel that those people, my peers, they are okay with their privilege and they want to keep that privilege. And because if it's overt, it doesn't go against their Christian, quote unquote, beliefs. But we're in a democratic state, and I've been in this democratic state my entire life, and we have all these policies that go against Black people. If there wanted to be a change, I feel like those majority people could come and change those laws, and they're not. And like you said, you educated me so much about things that have happened in the last 10 years. So my thing is, our allies are not going to come for us and help us like we want. And even within the allies, there's a difference between a Black Muslim and an Arab Muslim. The Arab slave trade is just as bad as the European Caucasian slave trade. There's a difference between Black Jews and white Jews. And so my thing is, what do you guys see as far as the real responsibility, the real reality? A lot of your quote unquote allies or your Democratic Party or whatever you say, they are making these laws that are not for us. And so we're not only going against the overts, we're going against people that want to keep their privilege and they're fighting hard for it. And what does that reality look like? Because I don't really see, at least for me personally, someone besides the one-offs, besides the Haleys. And even then, was she fighting for women's rights? Was she fighting for her own right or for our right or for everybody's right? Like, it's all good when we have a mutual ally, but I just feel like everybody benefited from the civil rights, but majority of us were in there. And I haven't seen anybody come to help us since then. So when people are like, why go for the Muslims? I'm like, why? Because you're Black first. So not the Black Muslims. They've always been here for us, but we're Black first before we're religion, before we're orientation, before we're anything. I have some people that I went to college with that were gay, and they talk about how the white gay men discriminate against them too. So again, we're Black first, and what does that look like for coming together, and what exactly do you need for us? Because we're ready to band together. There's so many different Facebook groups I'm in. Black Travel Group got 147,000 people in. Natural Hair, we got 800,000 people in. Like, we band together for common things, but tell us what we want to do, because that white savior is not coming, and we don't want to look for it.
I have to push back on the Black first thing. So I consider, because there's Black African American. So my parents are proud immigrants and Black Muslims. So my grandmother is half Arab, half Black, and so Arab and Black is something that I've seen very frequently. There are marginalized people, and that's one thing that people kind of overlook with Black Lives Matter, with the queer feminist lens. There are marginalized people within the Black community. So when you say Black first, doesn't make them any less marginalized for the other things that they have. So for instance, a Black person with a disability. I can't imagine, as a Black person with a disability, to state, well, why are we helping the people with the disabilities? I'm Black first. Doesn't make me being stigmatized for my mental illness any less worse, to be completely honest. And as a person that lives with a mental illness. So you will hear me when someone talks about mental illness, I jump up just as you were talking about someone's Black, because I'm marginalized for that, and I'm marginalized for this. Same thing for someone who identifies with LGBT and African American. They're being marginalized for being Black, but best believe if they were to walk with someone of the same sex that they're in love with, they're going to feel the heat too. In some places, even more. And so, I mean, I'm really, really passionate about intersectionality. It doesn't work sometimes, as we see in the suffrage movement. You know, Black women were on the forefront with our white sisters begging for the right to vote. But at the same time, Black first, Marianne Shadd Carey, who was one of the biggest suffragettes, African-American woman, had the first Black female national press on her. I mean, she's huge. No one hears about her. She wasn't recorded in the minutes by her African-American brothers when she spoke. She was Black at that moment, but was being marginalized by her Black brothers. So, I mean, this intersection as a dual minority, well, triple minority, Lord knows how many. I got so much on my plate for being stigmatized for, but there's just so much that we need to address every single oppression, or else, like, because if we do well, as if the Black man left us behind, guess where we would be? We wouldn't be very far, and some of them did leave us behind. So I really do think that it needs to be a united front, because for African American person who's Muslim that may have an Arab mother who is Muslim, who's from Iran, can't get inside the country. They're feeling the hurt and they're Black. So if we are Black with them, we need to be there for their mother as well, because they're feeling that. And just for a person who identifies as LGBT, if they're feeling the hurt for being LGBT, they're still Black, and we need to have their back. And that's why I think, so if anything, you are being Black first by taking care of everybody's different types of oppression. If you're really going to have their back, you need to fight for their communities as well, because they're still within our communities.
I think this may be our last one. Here you go, Miss Rosalind.
Let me say something good. Hi, my name is Jasmine Adams. I'm a organizer with the Asada's Daughters group, and I'm also a CPS teacher, 4th grade on the Southeast side. Yes, thank you. So I'm gonna keep it short. So one, to your point of how to make political spaces accessible. One thing I've learned working in political spaces, especially in the Washington Park area, is that the folks who are on the ground, who their everyday experience, they're more educated than people who read books. Their everyday experience teaches them things that I can never learn reading a theory book. And as someone who comes from Roseland, who went to Oberlin College, don't even get me started, and who is achieving all these degrees, that removed me a lot from the community I have. So when I come home, I pride myself on learning from folks who are always there. And I think that what needs to shift in spaces is what we deem as educated. Because I think that educated is more than the books you read and the shows you watch. I think most of the time, folks who are not book educated are the ones who should be at the forefront of the movement. So I do think we need to shift those narratives. And I also just, I love coming to these things because I like soaking up knowledge, to take them back to people in the hood and just break it down, to be completely honest. But for me, it's my question is, where do children fit into these conversations? And where do parents of children fit into these conversations? Because teaching 4th graders from the West Side and now being on the Southeast Side, I think that my 4th graders understand a lot more than we give them credit for. And I do think that they can articulate themselves in ways that we don't think that they can. So I always question, or maybe this is for the panelists or for anybody in the audience, you can talk to me later. Where do you see young children and young folks in general? My organization works with young girls and young femme-identifying folks, and now we're incorporating boys, shout out to us. But where do children fit into these narratives? Because I do think as older people, no shade to us, but it's not our time to be at the forefront. It's our time to facilitate young folks to take the movement to the places where it needs to go, and I rarely come into these spaces and see them being accessible to young children, but also to their parents. So where do y'all see kids fitting into these?
So I want to piggyback off something you said first, and I keep beating what seems to be a dead horse. But you brought up a point of how your degrees separated you from the people you're trying to serve. And I think I heard Brian Stevenson talk about this, about being proximate. And I think that a lot of times, at least for me, when I returned back to Chicago, I was in a different predicament when I left. And I felt like I had all the answers to come in and help these youth because this is where I came from. But I didn't realize how much distance had grown. And I went back and I'm like, well, look, hey, I grew up right down the street from here and I made it out of the situation. And the kid began to tell me how I didn't understand what he was going through. And I couldn't figure out how to understand because I went through what he went through, but that was 10 years prior too, right? So it's different. So I think we also had to look at, just because we're people of color, we had to be proximate, right? Because I rode the 71st Street bus to school every day, right? But now when I get on the 71st Street bus, I feel uncomfortable. But these are my people. This is my neighborhood. I grew up here. Why am I uncomfortable around my people? It's because I'm not as proximate to them as I used to be. So I begin to believe the stories that I hear, right? How Chicago is terrible when you can't go anywhere without getting shot. But I go all throughout the city and through the grace of God, I've never been shot before, right? So I'm living proof that you can go anywhere in the city and be safe. So I think we have to make sure, once again, just be proximate, right? We can't say, oh, I'm from Inglewood, right? But when the last time you've been back to Inglewood? Do you live in Inglewood? Do you patronize in Inglewood, right? So we also have to check our own privilege because I've been upwardly mobile, so I've been able to get away from a lot of the things, but I had to come back and make sure that the things that I'm telling to this great crowd of people are actually true. Because if I'm not talking to the people that are there now and having these experiences, that I went through, I don't even know if it's accurate anymore. So we have to make sure that just because we're people of color, that doesn't mean that we're not accountable to be proximate to the neighborhoods we come to or the people that we want to serve.
Just real quick, and I want to give a very concrete example of why that's so important. So I recently released a report, Handcuffs in Hallways, which examines the use of police officers in CPS. A young person is the reason of that report. This high school student was looking through the Citizens Police database for just his school officer. Found out that his school officer killed somebody. Came to an adult and told him about it. And we just started digging in deeper, deeper, and deeper. And we found that this whole practice of police officers and CPS was just far from best practice. That report is now concrete policy recommendations that has resulted in, there's a bill that was signed by the governor that we can no longer have booking stations in CPS. That was just signed into law. Now I'm currently working with COPA to find out how can we identify patterns and practices specifically for police officers in schools, all because of a young person was being nosy. Really. All of my work is, curious. My mom would call it nosy, but curious. But all of my work is from young people's stories. I rely on the people, specifically in the jail, to tell me what's going on. I'm like, that's not right. We need to be able to fix that. I had a lot of 18-year-olds saying, I never knew my social security number. I never got a birth certificate. Now, upon 90 days upon release from Cook County Jail, you get a free birth certificate. I went to the county clerk and said, you need to work with the jail to get them birth certificates because these kids don't have them because they're kids. So I think it is so important. I think young people are smarter than I am when it comes to issues around social justice, especially gun violence, their communities, because they're living it every single day and they take it for granted because they think, well, what do I know? I'm like, you know more than me with my law degree from UChicago. I don't know anything. Let's be honest. I get it from you. And it's just unfortunate that they can't be compensated for such.
That's what's up. I'm sorry, we got to cut it right there, sis. Go ahead. What you got, sis? Go ahead.
Shout out to John Hope.
Right. That was a perfect note to end on. Can y'all please give a round of applause to the sister too for adding that?